Sweden has fallen, folks. Sweden used to be one of those countries you would hear about and be like, oh, it's safe, developed, all that. And then I came across this video on my FYP, how Sweden went from Nordic safe haven to Europe's crime capital. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chaotic Cafes Live. I'm your humble host, Mr. Kingsley. I don't want to talk too much. We're going to hop right into the video. Today, we're looking at Sweden and how it went from a safe country to Europe's crime capital. Let's hop right in.
Sweden is suffering from a shooting epidemic. In 2024, there were 296 shootings, 129 bombings, and 44 people were killed with firearms in gang-related drug fights. For decades, Sweden was the country where nobody locked their doors and trust in institutions was absolute. It was a global model of cohesion and equality. The strongest welfare state in the world, which seems protected against crime, but it ended up creating its own nightmare. Today, criminal clans dominate entire neighborhoods with almost daily shootings, child soldiers, cars set on fire, and grenade explosions. The other three Nordic countries, did I hear that correctly? Norway.
Did he say child soldiers? What the fuck? Child soldiers in Sweden? Child soldiers?
And grenade explosions. The other three Nordic countries, Norway, Denmark, and Finland, also faced a migration, cultural tensions, and social challenges. But there, the annual firearm deaths are 1 or 2. So why, in Scandinavia, the safest corner of the world, Sweden became the exception? In this video, we will explain how Sweden went from being a paradise of peace and safety to falling into a spiral of violence more typical of a Latin American narco state. For much of the 20th century, Sweden was the example of a cohesive and functional society. A small, homogeneous, and stable country where almost everyone spoke the same language and shared the same cultural tradition. This homogeneity was reflected in social indicators, with crime rates among the lowest in the world, minimal violence, and moderate inequality. The Swedish welfare state was built on that foundation. High taxes were accepted by everyone because everyone trusted that the money would come back in the form of education, healthcare, and social protection. And that trust was not only economic, but it was also present in everyday life. Houses were left unlocked, bicycles could be left on the street without chains, and the word of a public official was assumed to be true. The legal and police system was built on this trust. It was a system that favored rehabilitation over punishment, with little preventative surveillance and few intrusive investigation tools. But this balance started to break in the early 1990s. Between 1991 and 1993, Sweden suffered a financial crisis that caused the worst recession the country had seen in 60 years. Unemployment went from almost a non-existent level.
Okay, so it's not just migration. It didn't start with migration. I want to make that very clear because that's one thing people like to, it's the migrants. No, it started with the economic crisis like most things, right? So keep that at the back of your mind, right? In fact, let's play that again.
Sweden suffered a financial crisis that caused
Sweden suffered a financial crisis, and that's what I'm assuming was the main thing that created the destabilization in society.
The worst recession the country had seen in 60 years. Unemployment went from almost non-existent levels to double digits, and social service budgets were cut. At the same time, the country accelerated a migration policy that had started a few years earlier.
Okay.
And with the outbreak of the Yugoslav wars, about 60,000 immigrants arrived in just a couple years.
Okay. So financial crisis, war, migration. So you see how connected everything is?
While the Gulf War and Saddam Hussein's repression of Kurds and Shiites brought another wave of thousands of refugees.
Okay.
From the first day, newcomers had access to public housing, free healthcare, schools for their children, and subsidies. It was not necessary to learn the language, have a job, or pass a civic exam to get residency and later citizenship. Integration was assumed to happen naturally as a spontaneous process that would come with time. But reality was very different. The Swedish labor market was not only in crisis, but it was also one of the hardest for immigrants to access. Collective labor agreements set high minimum wages, even for low-skilled jobs. Professional certifications were slow, and hiring networks worked through personal contacts that newcomers didn't have. So many got stuck in a cycle of long-term unemployment and welfare dependence.
Mhm.
At the same time, the lack of language and cultural requirements created a pattern of segregation, and communities started appearing that lived in the same territory but did not mix or share common rules. This was reinforced by the way the country had built its cities in the 1960s and 1970s. In those years, the Swedish government launched the Miljon Programmet, a massive plan to build 1 million homes in just 10 years. In a country of only 8 million people, it was perhaps the most ambitious housing program in the world. The idea was to house the growing working class in modern neighborhoods with heating and basic services to replace the wooden houses that still dominated at the time. At first, these blocks were occupied by Swedish working class families. But as the country prospered and incomes grew, many of these people moved to residential areas with better reputation. What they left behind were entire neighborhoods of massive, cheap, and increasingly empty buildings. And this is where refugees were housed. The problem was that these neighborhoods were disconnected from job centers, with limited transport lines and weak local commerce. It was an urban design that limited social mobility and reinforced exclusion. On top of this, the 1994 EBO law
Ghettos.
allowed asylum seekers to freely choose where to live.
So from what I understand, and guys, I'm speaking freestyle from the video, right? From what I understand, this is how ghettos typically form, right? So you would, abandoned locations of a country, you're gonna house the immigrants there, the asylum seekers there, and because they are disconnected, and typically because of no strong plan of integration, because migration in itself is not bad. Human beings have always migrated. Now, I understand homogeneity is quite important. I'm not gonna lie to you. It's quite important because when you all have the same mindset and the same way of thinking, it's easier to develop a country along those lines. Like, I think the only country that has been able to do that well to some extent has probably been America, because America, it was built on diversity. Let's be for real, bro. Everybody's built America. I don't know if any other country has been able to replicate it that same way. Migration is not a bad thing. You have to make sure it is controlled and the people you're bringing in are net positives, if that makes any sense. Like, there's nothing wrong with migration across the world, in my opinion, but just make sure at least the way I see it anyway, just make sure the indigenous people who have been able to create that structure, just make sure they are not replaced. Just make sure they are not challenged. That's the way I see it. Bring in some people, but don't bring in everybody. Bring in certain people that can add, that can be a net positive to your society. Either they're coming to work, they're coming to produce, they're coming with businesses, they're coming with the right. It's not just about that. It's also their mentality. What is the mentality like? If you're bringing in people who are very violent, you're bringing in people who are not willing to bend, to integrate, to learn a new way of life, then you're asking for disaster. I mean, come on, this is not rocket science. And beyond that, you have to also understand that these migrants are coming from somewhere. Typically, most migrants are fleeing something, right? Like was mentioned in the beginning, right? That was mentioned in the beginning. They are escaping war zone, the Yugoslavia war and the oppression of the Kurds in the Middle East. It's coming from somewhere, so it's a bigger picture conversation. But I'll shut up. I've been yapping. Let's keep going.
Many chose to settle in these neighborhoods where immigrant communities already existed, reinforcing segregation even more. Segregation was also encouraged by the 1992 school reform, which introduced free choice of schools. This allowed native Swedish families to leave these schools and send their children to others with better reputations. In just a few years, entire neighborhoods like Rinkeby in Stockholm, Rosengård in Malmö, or Biskopsgården in Gothenburg went from being working-class housing projects to immigrant enclaves with their own language and cultural codes. Unemployment became chronic, school failure rates soared, and crime became, for many young people, the only source of opportunity. By the mid-1990s, another phenomenon began to break the myth that Sweden was safe from organized crime: the Nordic Biker War. Gangs like the Hells Angels and Bandidos, made up entirely of Nordics, fought for control of drug trafficking and extortion in Scandinavia. The fights included shootings, explosives, and murders in broad daylight. At the same time, the post-Yugoslav war turned the Balkans into an endless source of cheap weapons smuggled into the country. For just a few $100s, Bosnian or Serbian gangs could sell you automatic machine guns and even throw in a few grenades for free. In addition, with Sweden joining the European Union in 1995 and the opening of the Öresund Bridge that connects it to Denmark in 2000, the country became more connected than ever with its neighbors and the continent. Now it was part of the Schengen area, which allows travel between countries with no border or passport checks. And Sweden, which until then had been a small market ignored by international drug cartels, became a big target. It was a rich country with growing consumption of recreational drugs, which guaranteed stable and high-value income for whoever controlled distribution. At this point, criminal networks started to specialize. Nordic bikers professionalized the...
Again, it's not just migrants. It's you see the evolution. Because I want us to stay focused on the evolution, the connection to the European market, the nefarious gangs that already were in Sweden and in Europe and in Denmark saw this opportunity to lead the charge. Because one thing that I've noticed that a lot of people like to do is, it's the Africans and the Arabs that are coming to fuck up the country. Bro, you've already had those negative influences there. Sure, it was controlled, but, you know, these gangs have always been there. You just open up the market for them, you know?
Business, bringing hierarchical structure and instrumental violence that didn't exist before. The Balkan gangs consolidated the supply of weapons and regional logistics. And the first family clans in segregated suburbs began to connect with these networks, offering territory and young people as labor for crime. So in just a few years, crime went from being scattered and opportunistic to a real criminal economy with money, military means, logistics routes, and territorial wars. On top of all this, the police system was divided into regional structures, with little coordination and no national strategy against organized crime. The legal framework was designed for a society where crime was rare, focusing more on rehabilitation than punishment, with short sentences, especially for minors. Young people from these neighborhoods were recruited by gangs because they knew that even if they were caught for serious crimes, they would spend only a few years in closed educational centers, not in prison. Meanwhile, strong legal guarantees and an obsession with privacy limited the use of wiretaps, hidden cameras, or undercover agents. The figure of collaborating witnesses, which is key in other countries to dismantle criminal organizations, almost did not exist. And witness protection was so weak that very few dared to testify against the clans. In this environment of fear and silence, cases collapsed in court and impunity became the norm. And when it seemed things couldn't get worse, 2015 arrived. By that time, Sweden had already received 1.5 million immigrants in the previous 3 decades. But in that year, during the European migration crisis, it received 163,000 more. It was the highest number per capita in all of Europe. For a country of just 10 million people, this was a monumental challenge.
Yeah.
But these refugees were not criminals. They were simply people fleeing civil wars and tyrannical regimes in Syria, Iraq, and
Most migrants are not bad people, bruh. Like it's like I don't understand. I don't like when you know migrants are being branded as evil people. Like, most people they're fleeing something. They're fleeing bad governments. They're fleeing chaos. They're fleeing wars, which a lot of these wars were stimulated by the West. I'm not saying Sweden. I don't think Sweden is that involved in other people's business. But bruh, Your neighbors, man, the UK particularly, the UK, Germany, NATO. Like you got to be honest, man. It might not be Sweden, but since you're part of Europe and you're part of the European Union, you're part of NATO. I assume, or America. You got this. These countries are always involved in the destabilization of other people's countries. You cannot ignore that. You cannot deny
and
that.
Afghanistan. However, they brought with them life experiences shaped by distrust of the state. For them, safety did not come from institutions, but from family, community, and in many cases, parallel figures of authority. And that was exactly what they found in the suburbs where they were sent. There, family clans acted as a state within a state, resolving disputes, imposing punishments, and offering protection in exchange for loyalty. Thousands of young people who wanted to integrate into a functional society ended up absorbed into a system where criminals made the rules. For these uprooted young people with no horizon of progress, crime became the only viable path to earn respect, money, and belonging. So in the following years, violence jumped to a new level.
You see the connection, folks? You see the connection? It's not just, oh, it's the Africans or the Arabs. It just so happened that the situation they are in nurtured that. You know? If you put Europeans in the same situation, it's going to be the same result you get. I understand. I empathize with the Swedes. I truly do. I get it. And I understand how it feels. But I'm just focused more on the why it just happens to be certain groups of people. It's not that these people are inherently bad. No. It's just the situation they're in. Because I guarantee you, if you put the Africans and the Arabs in a place where, you know, or if you filter a certain group, a certain demographic, you're going to get more positive responses.
In 2017 and 2021, there were almost 1,700 shootings and 220 deaths by firearms. No other country in Northern Europe had violence levels even close to this. In those years, the bloodiest war was the one between Shadows and Death Patrol, two gangs born in Stockholm's suburbs, made up mostly of Swedish Somalis. The rivalry started as a local conflict in the Rinkeby neighborhood, but soon escalated into an endless chain of revenge, which in a few years left dozens dead. The 2017 riots in Rinkeby, where a simple police arrest turned into a night of burned cars, looted shops, and clashes with police, showed the world that there were neighborhoods where the state had lost control. Even then President Donald Trump cited them as an example of a criminal dystopia created by mass immigration.
Take a look at what happened in Sweden. I love Sweden. Great country, great people. I love Sweden, but they understand I'm right. The people over there understand I'm right. Take a look at what's happening in Sweden.
In the middle of this spiral of violence, one event marked a turning point in public perception. In August 2020, a 12-year-old girl named Adriana left her house in Botkyrka, south of Stockholm, to buy a pizza. She never came back. She was hit by a stray bullet during a gang shooting, and her death shocked the whole country. Swedish society understood that violence had gone too far and that nobody was safe. A year later, in October 2021, Niels Gronberg, better known as Einar, was shot dead in Stockholm. He was 19 years old and one of the most listened to rappers in the country. His music spoke about life in the suburbs and was followed by young people all over Sweden, from poor neighborhoods to elite schools. His death put narco crime in the spotlight, showing that nobody, not even celebrities, was out of the gang's reach. Up until here, the story could be seen as gangs fighting in the streets for control of territory and drug trafficking. But in recent years, the problem became more complex when organized crime stopped living against the system and started living off the system. In 2021, Swedish police publicly recognized the existence of at least 40 active criminal clans in the country. Some with so much power that they could intimidate municipal officials to get public contracts or subsidies. The sophistication of these clans grew alongside violence, with networks that falsify identities, create fake people, and collect several subsidies at once under the same name. They created ghost companies that billed for services that were never provided, inflated contracts, and irregular payments. It is estimated that criminal networks extract between $9 and $13.5 billion a year from the state. The welfare
Damn.
state became
Holy
a financing
smokes.
machine for crime, and that is the real step into the logic of a narco state. Not when gangs dominate neighborhoods, but when they feed off the state's machinery and turn public funds into fuel for their own expansion. While violence and criminal businesses multiplied in Sweden's streets, the response did not first come from politicians, it came from the voters. In 2018, the Sweden Democrats, a nationalist and openly anti-immigration party, reached 17.5% of the vote and became the third strongest force in parliament. 4 years later, in 2022, violence peaked with 391 shootings and 62 firearm deaths in a single year. But the most shocking thing was not just the numbers, it was the scenes of violence, which everyone thought were impossible in a Scandinavian democracy. We are talking about grenades thrown at residential buildings, cars set on fire in supermarket parking lots, and executions in broad daylight in front of schools. Scenes more typical of countries that collapsed under narco trafficking. In addition, violence was no longer confined to segregated suburbs, but wealthy neighborhoods in Stockholm and Gothenburg also became scenes of explosions and revenge killings. Organized crime had crossed the psychological border that separated vulnerable enclaves from the rest of society. So, the national debate exploded. What for years had been denied or minimized now filled the front pages and dominated political conversations. Sweden was no longer an exceptionally safe country, and the media began comparing the Swedish situation with Latin American scenarios, with territories dominated by narco gangs, visible violence in daily life, and a state overwhelmed while trying to regain control. In that 2022 election, the Sweden Democrats won 20.5% of the vote and became the second most voted political force in the country. The law and order discourse, which had been marginal for years, became the center of the national conversation. Facing this new reality, the government presented an emergency plan, which included adding 10,000 new police officers, tougher migration controls, and restrictions on family reunification. But the impact of these measures was limited, so they went further with structural reforms. Legal changes increased sentences for minors involved in serious crimes, and institutional reforms turned some closed educational centers into high-security juvenile prisons. There was also a drastic reduction in residence permits and accepted asylum requests, which made 2024 the first year in half a century where Sweden had more emigrants than immigrants. Stricter audits were also introduced in the state to close the door on systematic fraud that fueled the criminal clans. With these measures, Sweden visibly abandoned its model of soft guarantees and moved to a much more punitive system of control. But far from dismantling organized crime, these reforms created unwanted effects. They increased internal executions within gangs, the result of betrayals and power struggles in a system under more state pressure. The export of violence expanded, with leaders taking refuge in Turkey and Dubai while continuing to run operations in Sweden from abroad, making prosecution even harder. Meanwhile, platforms like TikTok and Snapchat became new channels of propaganda and recruitment, speeding up the incorporation of younger teenagers into criminal networks. The problem is that these measures, although necessary, do not touch the root cause. Second and third generation immigrant youth remain trapped between two worlds, with few real opportunities for integration. Entire neighborhoods are still controlled by clans, where the law of the state weighs less than local intimidation. And public trust is broken. It is not enough to have more police, more prisons, and more repression, because a state can reinforce its force, but if it cannot rebuild